Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk to you about a very, very interesting slant on the perpetual debate on performance practice. That is, traditional playing versus the so-called theoretical authenticity, historically informed performance people. And the reason I'm bringing this up now is because you requested that I do it. A couple of you did, actually. I mentioned, I don't know, a while ago, that one of the ways that we can show that these, frankly, early music people who take the early music concept and move it forward to the turn of the 19th century, saying stupid things like Mahler's orchestra played without vibrato, even though the people who played in the orchestra said he did. That kind of nonsense. How we deal with that. And I'm not just talking about vibrato. There's also portamento and all kinds of stuff happening. For example, you've got, Les Siècles, that group under Roth, who puts together supposedly authentic performances of Ravel's Pictures at an Exhibition or the Stravinsky ballets. And we're talking about relatively contemporary music that they claim was performed according to authentic precepts, which they seem to invent as they go along. It's all very, very strange and very silly and kind of baffling. But there's a very, very easy way to get at it. And that way, I had suggested, was to simply make a list, which I did, of conductors who were born in the 19th century and who matured, by in the first decade or so of the 20th century. So their tastes were formed and their aesthetics were rotund and juicy and ready to rock. And, they were ready to go, but they lived to make LPs. Long-playing records where these guys could do whatever they damn well pleased, and we could hear and basically figure out what their perspective was by listening to those LPs, because there are a lot of them. And so I made a list of 52 conductors. And I'm going to run through them because one of you said, why don't you go through that list? It would be so interesting to know who these people were. And we can determine very, very simply what the parameters were of performance practice, by comparing what they did to what they may have done previously. We don't even need to know what they may have done previously. The reason we don't need to know is because all we need to know is what they did now. Because if the authenticity or historically informed people have a teeny tiny toe, ballet pointy toe to stand on, it would be because all of these conductors were telling contemporary orchestras, no, that's not the way it's done. That's not the way we did it in the good old days. You have to do it this way. And of course they didn't. They didn't at all. They never said a word about it for the most part. And that's what makes it so fascinating. So let's go through. I've taken the 52 conductors and put them into groups of 13 in chronological order from oldest to newest. The youngest was born in 1897. That's as far as I think I went. And there are really quite a few more. I mean, this is just a sampling. But I think it's a pretty damn comprehensive sampling. It's representative, let's put it that way. And let's go through them one at a time, and then you can see exactly what I am talking about. I also included composers who conducted their own works, because those are, I think, particularly telling examples of what we're discussing. So here we go. You ready? This is group number 1. I'm putting it up here for you to see. Bam! There it is. Group number 1 consists of the following. Arturo Toscanini. Now, Toscanini was born in 1867. That is only, my friends, let's remember, 40 or so years after the death of Beethoven. I mean, that's not a long time. That's a couple of generations, technically, and like the generation being 20 years. But it's, somebody who was born around the time that Beethoven died, probably still around the time Toscanini was born. I mean, we're not talking about long geological spans of time. So Toscanini is 1867, as you can see. Then we have Leo Blech 1871, the great Wagnerian. And Koussevitzky was 1874. And Montu was 1875. Bruno Walter was 1876. Tullio Serafin was 1878. Thomas Beecham was 1879. Karl Schuricht was 1880. Désiré Emile Engelbrecht, the great Debussyan, was 1880. Robert Stoltz, 1880. Leopold Stokowski, 1882. Igor Stravinsky, the same year, 1882. And Ernest Ansermet, 1883. I mean, that's really quite a list of conductors who lived into what I call the LP era. And what I mean by the LP era generally is the early 50s. Their music record recordings were on LP and recorded in decent enough sound so that we can sort of hear what was going on in the orchestra at the time, because so many of these people sit around, with their ears glued to their 78s played by, number 7 darning needles and the sound horn coming out going, oh, I hear the vibrato. No, you don't. You can't. It's not physically possible in an orchestral situation. You can hear the absence of certain things, but when you take out things like surface noise and recording defects and all of these other problems, let me put this down now, wait a second, you realize that it's virtually impossible to actually hear some of the things that they pretend to hear. I remember having a big argument with friends of mine about, the Nickish Beethoven Fifth from 1905 or something. And they're like, the second movement, the cellos aren't playing with vibrato. I mean, that is such horseshit. It's unbelievable. You can't tell one way or another. I mean, there's no frequency range. You don't hear any bass. You don't know what they're doing. All you hear is this thin stream of sound coming through the... And if they've used noise reduction, that's chopped up. You've chopped out even more of the overtones and other things nowadays. It's really, So you can't believe everything that you're told about historical performance. That's why I think it's far more valid to listen to modern recordings in stereo of these same artists doing the same music, because not only would they have said something if it really meant anything, the fact that we don't hear these things means that even if there were minor differences in performance technique that evolved over time, they didn't matter. They weren't important enough that you should make choices of performances based on the claims that these people make for the significance of what they do. It just didn't matter. And that is another issue that is also worth considering. And there are some more coming down the pike. So let's look at example number 2. Here it is. There we go. Okay, so who we got? Fritz Stiedry from 1883. Hermann Abendroth, 1883. Václav Talich, 1883. Nikolai Malko, 1883. Albert Wolff, 1884. Look at when some of these people died. 1968, 1970, 1975, Otto Klemperer, 1885. Vittorio Gui, 1885. Furtwängler, 1886. Gabriele Santini, 1886. Paul Paret, 1886. Robert Hager, 1886. Nadia Boulanger, 1887. Hector Heitor, Villa-Lobos, 1887. I mean, these people lived into the 70s. And you don't see them running around telling people, no, you can't use portamento, you can't use vibrato, your horns have to do this, your trumpet has to look like that, your woodwinds have to do this. I mean, they just don't do it on their recordings, the audible evidence. So that covers the next bunch of 13, the next gang of 13. And you see that several of them were composers. Some of them I put down were composers, but they were failed composers, like Klemperer, but he did record his own music. Furtwängler as well. That's why I included them. Paul Paret as well. And Villa-Lobos, of course, was primarily a composer. So there you go. And you can tell from listening to those people that they had no problem with contemporary performance techniques in music that was supposedly written before those techniques existed. I mean, it's really kind of fascinating and flabbergasting. But of course, I understand, when you put on a record, you don't stop to think how old the artist was when it was recorded. And we don't stop to think about the periodicity that the historically informed people, I call them the historically deluded people, are claiming for what happened and what happened when. Oh, it was before World War I. After World War I, everyone said, okay, the war's over, we can now use vibrato. I mean, that's the kind of foolishness that they would have us believe. But you can see from when these people were born that their aesthetics must have been formed, before 1910. If they were born in the 1880s, by the time 1905 came along, 1910 came along, they were in their 20s. They were getting out of conservatory. They were starting their careers. And the ones that lived to the 70s, well, I mean, it speaks for itself, doesn't it? We've got the recordings that we can listen to and enjoy. So now let's look at the next group. This is group number 3. Here it is. Okay, we've got Knappertsbusch, 1888, Fritz Reiner, 1888, Adrian Bolt, 1889, Charles Munch, 1891, Hermann Scherchen, 1891, Nikolai Golovanov, 1891, Victor de Sabata, 1892, Darius Milhaud, 1892, Eugene Goossens, 1893, Anthony Collins, 1893, Vladimir Golschmann, 1893, Paul van Kempen, 1893, and Clemens Krauss, 1893. 1893 must have been a good year for conductors, huh? Now, one of the things you see here is that I've tried to make the list as varied as possible in terms of nationality. And because, one of the other things that these authenticity people do, which I think is, totally bogus and ridiculous, is they make a big deal out of people coming from different schools. That is, they break up European music into little tiny bits. And so you have the French school and the Czech school and the English school and the Central European school, the German school, whatever it is. And from those, they adduce differences between and amongst the different schools, which justify them doing their particular approach for that particular repertoire in that particular place on that particular day. And what I need to say once again is that it's bunk, because in addition to this, what we can prove quite easily is that musicians are peripatetic. That is, they run around, they play in different places. Where they were born has very little to do with where they often wind up. Yes, there is still local talent. There are still local traditions in terms of repertoire choices, for example, that people know. Let me take this away now. You've seen it. But the fact is, they have no way of demonstrating that the quotidian circumstances that these period deluded people purport to reproduce in their performances actually existed at any given time, at any given place. Especially when you're dealing with music written in the early 20th century, the late 19th century, when all of these orchestras were being formed. And I mean, Karl Flesch, the great German violinist, he's German violinist. He wrote all this stuff about, performance technique and everybody's performance technique, and Fritz Kreisler and all those people. He played in the Lamoureux Orchestra in France. You can't generalize. Charles Munch is one of the best examples, because Charles Munch, who everybody thinks of as a quintessentially 20th century modern conductor with the Boston Symphony and did all this French stuff, was the concertmaster of the Leipzig Gewandhaus under Furtwängler and Bruno Walter, for heaven's sake, right? And that's the pedigree. So, if you're talking about, one group did it one way, one group did it another way, you have a very heavy burden to demonstrate that what you're doing is what they did on the day. And of course they can't. I mean, it's just an absolute craziness. So let's look at our last list, the last group. Group 4. Here it is. And we have Carl Boehm, 1894. Arthur Fiedler, 1894. Franco Capuana, 1894. Paul Hindemith, 1895. Hans Rosbaud, 1895. Malcolm Sargent, 1895. Howard Hansen, 1896. Dmitri Mitropoulos, 1896. Pedro de Freitas Branco, an excellent conductor, by the way, from Portugal. He was the brother of Luis de Freitas Branco, the composer. 1896. Antonio Votto, 1896. Remember, he made a bunch of those Callas opera things, and other people as well. Edward Flipsa, 1896. Virgil Thomson, 1896. And finally, last, but oh my, not least, George Szell, 1897. And there you go. I mean, that's 52 conductors. Some of them the biggest and best known names of the 20th century, some of the best known tyrants of the 20th century. Let me get rid of this now. And you can be damn sure that if anybody was doing something that they thought was wrong, then they would have said so. They would have gotten out there and said, no, when I grew up in Vienna in 1905, they played it this way, and that's what you have to do, and you're doing it all wrong. None of that. There's none of that. None of that at all. And then to sort of summarize some of these ideas that have been percolating around now that we've been talking about, there's another thing I want to point out, and that's this. The classical tradition of performance is very sticky. It changes very slowly because provenance is critically important. Maintaining the tradition is critically important in the world of classical music. Performers, individual performers, however they were trained, always point to their pedigree. So-and-so was trained by so-and-so, was trained by so-and-so, who was trained by Mozart, who was trained by God. I mean, that's the pedigree. And so they're not going to change things unless it's consistent with the aesthetic that was taught to them, that is being transmitted down to them. And one of the reasons that today's historically deluded performers are so kooky is that their whole approach to the classical music tradition is absolutely wrong. I mean, totally wrong, completely certifiably wrong. It's what Richard Taruskin said, a long time ago, decades ago, that they're simply trying to pursue a wholly 20th century aesthetic, which completely rejects the tradition, the provenance, the pedigree upon which modern performance is based. And one of the ways we know this is because if we look at what composers said about music in their day and what they were looking to do, composers from the 18th century on, well, really before that, well before that, but for our purposes, from the end of the Baroque classical period, the 18th century, were progressives. They were out and out progressives. They believed that within this aesthetic, within this sticky, only make changes that were consistent with the aesthetic whatever, the aesthetic parameters in which they were working, they still believed that music was progressing. They were looking forward, that change was good. So when they accepted something, when something fit, when they accepted a change to instrument construction, when they lengthened the neck of a violin, when they do any of those things, they were doing it because they believed it was consistent. It was absolutely consistent with what the composers would have wanted, because they too were looking to the future. We're looking to things getting better. We're looking to improvements in standards. And of course, the historical record speaks for itself. Those standards did improve. They improved enormously. The reliability of instruments, the quality of ensemble, all of those things were part of an onward march of progress. And in order to claim that things were more appropriate, you don't even have to say better. Let's get rid of the value judgment part, just the more idiomatically appropriate back then as opposed to now, you essentially have to make a value judgment and say, well, that's what the composer really wanted. That's what the composer really expected to hear. Well, it may have been what the composer expected to hear because he had no choice. But does that mean that's what they invariably wanted? Hell no. We know that composers always were pushing the envelope, were writing things that were more difficult, more challenging. Wagner was inventing new instruments all over the place. They were always eager to seize on whatever innovation would allow them to realize their artistic vision. And that artistic vision was one of ever increasing levels of competence, of excellence in performance. So you can't go back to the day when things were like sucky and say, oh, that's what the composer really wanted. That's what's correct for this particular piece. That is absolute nonsense. And in fact, just today, somebody posted a comment, a very odd comment, I thought, about the Jordi Savall Beethoven's, where he said, well, if Beethoven woke up and heard these performances, he would have been completely thrilled because it's exactly what he wanted. And my response to that, frankly, is bullshit. Total, absolute, errant nonsense. Beethoven would have been happy with today's Beethoven, with the very best that it would be possible to achieve within his own school. He would have changed the trumpet parts in the coda of the Eroica Symphony in a heartbeat if he had trumpets with valves that could play all the notes. There's no question about those things. None whatsoever. And so to go back and recreate that kind of silliness is, I think, just absolute artistic suicide. It's a terrible, terrible thing to do. But to get back to our list of conductors, as you can see, you have a wonderful mix of 52, a whole deck of cards, that's how I did it, conductors who had no problem performing music with the best, most modern, most efficient, effective resources they could get their hands on. They delighted in them. They reveled in them. They did not attempt to go back to the circumstances that obtained in the 1880s and 90s and sometimes 70s in which they were born. They had no desire to do that at all. And there can only be two reasons for that. One is because they were absolutely convinced that what they had was better than what they had was there formerly, number one. And number two, that there was nothing inconsistent with what they had in the 60s and 50s and 60s and 70s when they made those LPs. There was nothing inconsistent with the idiomatic aesthetic expression of the music that they were performing. Nothing. I mean, look at Pierre Monteux. Pierre Monteux was at the premiere of the Franck Symphony in D minor, and he recorded it in the 1960s with the Chicago Symphony in stereo. It's glorious. And it's a wholly modern sound. Do you think they couldn't have done that in the 1880s? Sure they could have. Did they? Maybe they did. One thing we do know is that they could not have done what the period instrument people insist was idiomatic and appropriate in light of the fact that we have a guy who was at the premiere, conducting it in stereo. Why don't they use those examples? Why do these people pretend that by looking at instrumental treatises and other nonsensical things like that, which may or may not have been used or read by anybody, I mean, let's face it, why do they think that that's a better way to get at the truth of what was happening than listening to the people who were actually there and lived to set down documentary evidence in superb sound of what they heard? That is the question, which I find fascinating. So I hope this little chat has given you some food for thought, and listening backwards has taught us more than anything else that we're just not dealing with a huge amount of time. I mean, these people, some of them had very long lives, but they lived through tremendous technological change to make recordings, to document their work, to document their lives and beliefs and aesthetic wishes and ambitions, and to leave evidence, testimonial evidence as to what consists of correct performance practice. Going back to the 1890s and before, the 1870s and before, because they were taught by people who were around 20 or 30 years before that. Don't you see? We cover that whole period, 150, 200 years of musical history and tradition in performance is all available to us in beautiful, modern stereo. The evidence is right there if only we would see it and accept it for what it is. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.